Today on Dead Dodge Garage, it's the big My Classic Mopar Won't Crank or Run video diagnosis how-to guide. If you can smell this little workshop area in my home shop through the video, how do you think I feel? You know what they say though, whatever doesn't kill you may simply cause great injury and long-lasting health effects. I drew this handy-dandy diagram for the charging system video. It gives a brief look at the major components we're going to be talking about. I don't quite have the patience to draw a detailed flowchart to do these tests, but I'll try and give you as much useful information as possible. The purpose of this video is going to be aiding you in diagnosing your classic muscle-era Chrysler vehicle that will not crank and will not start. A side note as usual. Take any advice I give you with a grain of salt, as I am untrained, merely experienced. One other side note. Chrysler starters don't often die, but sometimes they do. If you can hear your starter relay definitely clicking away, but you're not getting a crank, you can go ahead and stop the video now and go hit your starter with a hammer. That's likely going to be your issue. Point number 1. Your battery. I don't care if there was power in it last night. Is there power in it now? You could have a draw or something silly. The best thing to do would be pull out a multimeter. What you want to see is a voltage between 12.4 or so and 12.8 or so at the battery. If you don't, that could be an issue. But you should still get some kind of life way down to like 11 volts. One fun issue I've had many times are loose battery terminals. I tend to leave them a little bit loose for easy battery swappage, but it's not at all uncommon to hit the key in the morning, get one satisfying clunk sound, and then no joy, no power anywhere in the car. This is a telltale sign of a battery connection issue. Usually, if they are a little bit loose, you grab them and just start twisting them around, reefing them down tight, clean them out, hit them with something, whatever you got to do to get a better connection. Now here's where things start getting fun. Let's say you've checked the battery, there's definitely power, you've verified the connections, or at least kind of sort of okay, but there's still nothing going on. Do you have power getting from the battery into your car? On a classic Mopar vehicle, this can start to get a little complicated. In these old Chryslers, there are actually several steps electricity has to take between the battery and getting to the rest of the car, including the fuse box and the ignition, which is actually not powered through the fuse box, but don't worry about that. There is a quick and easy check you can do to see if you do have power into the car or if you do not. I like to hit the headlight switch. If the lights come on, then there's power. If they don't, well, either the headlights are broken or there is not power. If your headlights are out or your switch is unhooked or bad or you have another known issue, you could also turn the key on and check other accessories, wiper motor, heater, blinkers, etc. If any of these do work, then you've got power going into the car. If you don't, refer to this list. Here, in order, are a list of the different components power has to go through to get into the car. If you're having an issue here, you can follow along and test these items one by one with a test light, voltmeter, or other similar device. Power first leaves battery positive and goes to the larger threaded connection on the starter relay. On a classic Mopar, this is either on the inner fender driver's side or on the firewall. It leaves there and goes through a wire to the fusible link. The fusible link is mounted right outside of the firewall connection. It will be labeled fusible link. If it's melted, you can usually grab it and just pull it apart. If it looks good and feels solid, this is likely not your issue, but I have seen a good few of them cooked. From there, we go to the firewall connection. Now we discussed this in the charging system video. Problems here are not at all uncommon. I would unplug this connector and look inside. If you see evidence of burning, melted wires, green corrosion, bad looking stuff, this could well be your problem. It's definitely worth cleaning, greasing, and reinstalling in any case. From the firewall connection, power moves straight to the amp gauge. This is another common source of issues. With a break inside the amp gauge or poor connections on the back of it, no power can flow to the car. It's wired like this so the amp gauge can measure the charge and loads coming from the alternator and the electrical system respectively and verify if the battery is being charged or discharged. You can get up behind the dash with a test light or a similar tool and check for power on both sides of the amp gauge. This would be the most reliable test to verify if this is your issue. If you suspect this may be your issue because everything under the hood looks all right, you can disconnect battery negative and move with, I believe, a 3/8 socket, one of the wires from the back of the amp gauge onto the post with the other. With them touching like this, the amp gauge is taken out of the equation. If this solves your problem, there you go. Amp gauge is cooked. You may want to leave it like that, or you may want to replace it. That's up to you. Power then moves from the amp gauge to the fuse box and the ignition. The ignition is powered with direct battery current. It is not powered through any of the fuses, so you should be able to get a crank, even if there are issues there. If you've gone through this checklist, haven't found any issues, or you do have working lights, accessories, and the like, but you still have no crank, the next place to look would be at the starter relay and its various circuits. But before you do that, there's one more thing I forgot. The ignition switch disconnect, or connector, under the dash. This can be found roughly at the base of the steering column and carries all power to and from the ignition switch. This is also a common source of issues. The most common issues are on the red battery feed wire and on the blue ignition 1 wire, simply because they carry the most load and do the most work. It's not common to see issues on the crank circuit here, but you should be aware that that connector is there, and it could also be causing your issue. One more thing to be aware of. Power goes in through here, but it then turns around and goes back out through here as well. Through here and back through the firewall connector to get outside to the engine. Here is a poorly drawn artist's rendering of the starter relay and a look at its various circuits. A couple things to note. Functionally, this is a relay. It is not a solenoid. It does not carry the heavy load from the battery to the starter. The relay's job is to carry a lower amperage signal that is triggered by the key to trigger the solenoid built into the starter. It does this as a relay does. It takes power and ground from a lower amperage circuit here and connects an input from the battery to an output to the starter. This gives us a couple handy tools. First off, to test this issue, and in general when working on a Mopar, you can bridge the connections on this relay to get it to crank. It should be noted, Prudence the Safety Goat says, only do this with your automatic transmission in park, your manual transmission in neutral, and your parking brake set. I cannot be held liable if you run yourself over. Anyway, you can take a screwdriver and bridge the battery connection to the starter connection here. It should spark and it should crank. If it does not, then this is not your issue. It should be noted also, this test can be used to verify the battery circuit, battery cables that is, and the starter itself before getting into the previous test we discussed, going through and checking the car. If it cranks like this, battery and starter are just fine. You need to look elsewhere. These relays have been known to fail. I have replaced many of them over the years. The handy dandy test here verifies everything else is okay. But let's figure out the circuits for this thing. To trigger it, you've got key power coming in here on the slightly angled terminal. Ground to complete the relay circuit comes in here from the neutral safety switch. This will either be mounted down on the side of your automatic transmission, or it will be above the clutch pedal under the dash. It is important to note, this bolt is not the ground for this relay, unless you have the early style manual transmission relay, which has this terminal grounded directly on the case. Then it is the ground for that circuit, so it might be worth checking. Important takeaways here. Common issues are going to be neutral safety switch, which can also be caused by shifter adjustment, or the relay itself. It is possible to have an issue here from the key switch. Most of those issues would be covered on the flowchart on the previous page, amp gauge being the most likely. But it is possible to have a key switch failure. It's rather uncommon, but the way to check that would be verify you've got power going in and then verify you've got power coming out. So let's say you've got lights that are working, your key seems to be turning on the dash, everything seems to be okay. You can eliminate everything we talked about on the flowchart. What you need to be looking at then are starter relay issues. As previously discussed, you need power and ground for them to function. The main issues I've seen here again are relay failure and neutral safety failure. So how do we check which one it is? With a test light connected to battery positive, you can remove the neutral safety wire and check it for ground. Your light should light up. If it doesn't, the neutral safety is your issue. You could also have a shifter alignment issue. If wiggling the shifter gets the light to light, there you go. You need to adjust your shift linkage. Let's say you don't have a neutral safety switch, or yours is broken and you can't find a replacement, but you really want your car to start from the key. All you need to do is make yourself up a little ground wire that connects on this terminal. It can ground on this bolt, or any bolt that's a good ground. It can also run all the way to battery negative if it makes you feel warm and fuzzy. But as long as you have power coming from your key and some flavor of ground here, this relay should engage and your starter should crank. Just be aware that you will no longer have neutral safety switch operation. I don't really like to do this now that I have children around, but it is a way to make it work. Also be aware that this bypass of the neutral safety system will definitely violate rules of various sanctioning bodies for automotive racing. Just to help visualize everything I mentioned on the chart before, I drew this hard to understand and terribly written diagram, complete with happy little accident. It's important to be able to visualize this and see just exactly where power flows. Every point on this diagram is something that you can check if you're having a no crank, no start problem. Although this circuit is simple in its operation, it's somewhat complex in that power must go through several different points to get to where it needs to be, which is why this really isn't all that uncommon an issue. Power leaves the battery over here. It stops at the starter relay for a nice convenient junction point. It goes through a fusible link, through the firewall connector, through the amp gauge, out of the amp gauge to the back of the fuse panel, but split off there, not through a fuse, into the ignition switch connector. It goes through this to the key switch. Crank circuit then turns around and comes back out of the key switch, through the ignition switch connector again, through the firewall connector again, and all the way back to trigger the relay. If you're not getting a crank signal, as in someone hits the key for you and you have no positive power on this wire that should be triggering this relay, any of these points could in theory be the problem, until you eliminate those as possibilities using your test light or multimeter. Since I happen to have a test subject handy, I thought I'd give you a visual representation of some of these techniques on the car. This is a 1964 Dart. So as you can see, the relay is mounted on the firewall. These will often be found on the inner fender near to the battery, but regardless, the functionality is the same. Circling back to the first issue I mentioned. Let's say you go out to start the car in the morning and you got nothing. You try to turn on the headlights. No joy. No key accessories work. You suspect there is no power going through the firewall connector, out of the amp gauge, through all those other things we mentioned, and getting to your key switch. The way to verify that it's not a dead battery, a dead starter, or anything of the like. Take your little screwdriver. You'll see these are disconnected because for this test, it doesn't matter what's going on with these at all. If you bridge these two connections, you should get a crank. If you do, your starter's fine, your battery's fine, your battery cables are fine, and you need to move on to looking in the car. For these next couple tests, I've got my handy power probe again, which is even more broken than before. You can achieve the same thing with a test light or even a multimeter. I don't have an assistant today, so I'll just show you. This yellow wire is the crank signal from the key. Regardless of what's going on with the neutral safety switch, if the key is turned to crank, this should have power. So with your assistant turning it, it should be lighting up. The brown wire on this relay, which is likely to vary in color based on year, model, etc., is the neutral safety wire. This is what gives the relay ground. You should be able to, with the vehicle in park or even neutral, or with the clutch depressed by an assistant, you should be able to find ground in here. Another important conceptual note here. With this wire from the neutral safety switch disconnected, you will never get a crank because there is no ground to complete the circuit inside this relay. If you suspect that's your issue or you've found no ground there, you can run a wire from this terminal to the bolt or to battery negative or whatever you want. That's a good ground. That should allow the relay to click if everything else is good. Here is a very difficult to acquire and uncomfortable view of the back of the amp gauge. You can see, kinda, that it has a black and red wire. With your test light, multimeter, or power probe, with the battery connected, you should find power on both of those wires. If you don't, this could well be your issue. You would see power on the one side, but not the other. That would be indicative of a failed amp gauge.
Like a turtle.
Here on the Toolbox Charger, I found a good example of what you can expect to find in your firewall disconnect when it's getting bad. This one apparently was melted to the point that wires are coming out. And you could see more damage here. I did discuss this in the charging system video, but I wanted to circle back around to it. If you're not having issues like this and you want to prevent them in the future, a great way to help do that would be to add a shunt wire from alternator charge to battery positive. That takes a lot of the load off of these various circuits we're talking about and reduces the likelihood that things like the amp gauge will fail, although it certainly doesn't completely eliminate them. There's one last thought I'd like to cover, and it relates to people giving electrical diagnostic advice on the internet. Anytime anyone has an electrical issue, someone is bound to chime in and say, "Check the grounds!" And sure, for things like broken dash lights, wiper controls, you need grounds. But here's the thing, with a no crank, there are two grounds that factor into this, exactly two. One of them, there it is, battery negative to the block. Okay, with the screwdriver to the relay check, you've already verified if that is good or not. The only other ground is the ground for the starter relay, which goes through the neutral safety switch, which we've spent a good bit of time talking about, and hopefully by now you know how to diagnose. Other than the neutral safety issue, just about all of the no crank issues I've run into relate to one of these components. So go through the chart and figure out which one it is. And another thought brought on by something I was asked about the other day. If you have a vehicle which has been extensively modified, electrically speaking, from factory, like, I don't know, this, whatever's going on over there, all of this advice will go out the window. A lot of the concepts I'm discussing here, like checking for power everywhere there should be some, will apply to these modified vehicles, or heck, even to a Ford. But the specifics are only going to apply to a classic era Chrysler, muscle car, truck, something similar that is still in factory form. If you've got a 12-valve Cummins sticking up where your hood should be, I probably can't help you. But I will try. And if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them down in the comments. Thanks for watching.